Yeah, so I came to DC in 2001 as a student at Georgetown and started working in labor activism once I was there. Initially with workers on campus, with the union that was on campus, and through that got connected to Mackenzie Barris, who was the director of DC Jobs with Justice at the time. She sort of recruited me to work on other things in the city, including through the Student Labor Action Project at the time. So started, attending more sort of labor solidarity events and things throughout the city, and also was able to get connected in a way that was helpful to activism we were doing on campus, specifically a campaign that we did to win a living wage for workers at Georgetown. I think when I first came to Georgetown, it was sort of meeting and talking to workers on campus, some of whom had a union, some of whom didn't. Getting to know them and their stories, and then really wanting to connect that to the broader movement in the city, both knowing that we would need support to get what we needed done at Georgetown, but also wanting to be supportive of other worker struggles around the city. I think the initial connection to that for me from coming to Georgetown was I had worked at a union job in high school. I had family members who were parts of the labor movement where I'm originally from in upstate New York. And so it was something that I was interested in to begin with, but once I started to meet people and get more engaged on campus, like the connection to what was happening off campus seemed just that much more important.
What was happening?
On campus, both. So on campus, there was a group of, a pretty large group of mostly house cleaning staff, but also security guards that were not part of any labor union. They were, subcontracted out by the university. We're getting paid close to what minimum wage was at the time, which I can't even remember what it was, but significantly less than it should have been. And so, they were really struggling. And so, as we started to connect with them and talk to other workers on campus about the need to improve conditions, we really, we connected with the labor union that was there, but that also connected us to other things in the city. And then, citywide at that time, I think that, there were a lot of different things that we got engaged with. I remember specifically some work with some folks who did printed the Washington Post and the inserts. They were going through a fight with the Post leadership at the time, so got pretty engaged in that. Tried to help out with campaigns that were happening, especially at other universities around food service workers and janitorial staff mostly. So there were a number of different things. And then, in the broader sense too, just being in DC, Jobs with Justice is a local organization, but was still involved in a lot of other things that were happening in the city at the time, whether it was pushing back against the sort of more disruptive forces of corporate globalization through protesting the IMF and World Bank meetings when they would happen here, or other larger national events that were happening in the city. After my time at Georgetown, I started working in the labor movement for the Service Employees International Union here locally in Montgomery County. That kind of kept me in touch still with Jobs with Justice. I actually worked on an organizing campaign at a group home company in DC. So, we're still kind of engaged with them in terms of their support for that campaign. And then, I did some other things for a while outside of the labor movement, but sort of stayed involved with Jobs with Justice just as a supporter and activist. And then came back to working directly for DC Jobs with Justice through a campaign when Walmart first announced that they were going to bring stores to DC. I was actually working for a nurses union in DC at the time, but there was a transition happening there, so I started talking to Mackenzie, who was still the director then, and it was originally just as temporary work because they weren't sure how long the campaign was going to last, but we started the Respect DC campaign to push back on Walmart's entry, to insist that they agree to community benefits agreements so that make sure their entry was going to actually help the communities that they were coming to. But really trying to push back overall on their model of exploiting both workers and the communities that they often enter. And that turned into a longer term job with DC Jobs with Justice, working for them directly, not just on that, but on some day labor organizing that was happening at the time, as well as getting involved in the broader National Jobs with Justice network through different conferences and training. So, yeah, I mean, it was really a great experience. I think it was a really it was a pretty powerful campaign. It was very difficult, I think, dealing with the forces that Walmart brought to bear, both in terms of money and influence and the lobbyists that they were able to hire for the city council. But I think that, we really built some strong relationships and connections within the communities Walmart was trying to enter. It was a lot of time attending advisory neighborhood committee meetings, meeting different citizen activists from around the city, in the places that they were trying to come. And there were a lot of great people who we met through those connections, but also it was great to get engaged, through the larger Jobs with Justice network with Walmart workers from other parts of the area. Cynthia Murray, who's still a leader within the Walmart organizing group that still exists, lives in Maryland. She would come to the city a lot to talk about her experience as a Walmart worker. Graciela Green, who is also from that area, she really came out and spoke at a lot of our events about the negative impacts that Walmart has, not only on its workers, but again, they live in the communities around where they work. And so we're really able to bring that sort of to bear. And then in other parts of the city, we worked with Tom Brown a lot, who ended up running for city council in Ward 7. We worked with Edwin Jones, who's a pastor there, Courtney Stewart from the Reentry Network, who I know is still very much involved with DC Jobs with Justice. So it was a lot of long-lasting connections that I think we built through that campaign. And then, we did a lot of pretty amazing things to raise awareness and bring attention to the issue. We had a very big parade from one of the locations that they unfortunately did build on New Jersey Avenue and H Street down to their corporate lobbying offices in Chinatown, where we sort of showed off that the mayor at the time, Vincent Gray, was in bed with Walmart. We also were able to really, I think, draw a lot of national attention through the work around the Large Retailer Accountability Act to Walmart's entry into cities and what the negative consequences of that were going to be. Unfortunately, as everybody who lives here knows, there are 3 Walmarts of the 6 that they were proposing to build, and really, I feel like the city leadership did end up kind of getting scammed in the end, because a lot of the talk was about the stores that they were going to build east of the river in Ward 7, and those are the ones that don't exist. And so, Walmart did, to a certain extent, what they wanted. They didn't get as large of a footprint, and I think they've, from the overall, pulled back on their sort of plans to build more stores in urban areas around the country, including here. But, I think the connections that we built, some of the attention we were able to draw both locally and nationally, and the fact that I think that in the end it was sort of proven that Walmart all along was just trying to scam the city to get what it wanted, and was successful in doing that. Hopefully some of those people learned lessons from that as well. So. Yeah, I think that, luckily there hasn't been, I think in DC, development has continued to be development, and it is, harmful to a lot of communities that have been here for a long time, and I don't think that has really changed. I think some of the projects that, people were looking at building, there's been more thought given to. The Skyline project is still moving forward in Ward 7, but they are now, highlighting the local business elements of it. I don't think anybody, including us, is 100% happy with what that project looks like now, but I do think there's been a little bit more of a focus on what that local impact's going to be. But I think time will also tell how much these lessons have really been learned. The mayor who's here now, Muriel Bowser, she was somebody who supported Walmart coming. Some of the development that's been happening now, I would say she probably hasn't learned as many lessons from it as we would have liked. And same thing with Vincent Gray, who's now in the council in Ward 7. But it is something we can kind of point to them, especially as they are looking at other developments, especially east of the river, about the importance of making sure that these companies actually are going to do something that's going to benefit the communities that they're entering. So yeah, for sure. I think that I work for a labor union now. I worked for labor unions before. I worked for DC Jobs with Justice, and it's great to have a membership organization like labor union. It's great for workers who are involved. It brings a lot to the table, especially in terms of trying to level the playing field between workers and corporate interests. But in the end, thanks to the way labor law works in the United States, thanks to just kind of the history of this, as sort of capital and corporations have become more powerful, it can't work without support from community. It can't work without support from other organizations that aren't specifically labor organizations. And, the connections are easy to make because, workers are not just workers. They live in their communities. They go to school. They send their kids to school. They participate in other community organizations. And so a lot of those connections are pretty natural. But I think without something like DC Jobs with Justice and that kind of coalition, really working with more intention to make those kinds of connections, they don't always happen naturally. And so I think that the Walmart campaign is kind of a perfect example of how those things can come together really well, where it's not just then workers who somebody could, or especially somebody more cynical elected official or somebody could kind of brush off and say, oh, they're just doing this because their union bosses are telling them to, or they're just doing this to protect their own interests. When you can build that broader community coalition and have people really talking to each other, not just at the workplace, but also at church or also at a community organization, also at, PTA meeting. I mean, those are all places where these people meet and come together. Those ANC meetings being a perfect example as well. And, all of a sudden you have not just, it's people who are looking out for their own interests or being pushed by their union to do something. This is more of something that's coming from the community. People understand each other and know each other. And then again, it's the connections that can be made through that too. I mean, I think people like Cynthia and Grishila, who came here to talk about their experience working at Walmart, they might never have met some of the folks like Courtney, like Edwin Jones, who got really involved in that campaign. There's no other way that those connections would have happened without, the sort of coalition that Jobs with Justice brings to the table. And then the other part of that when it comes to these corporations is, again, in a lot of ways, they're used to, at this point, dealing with labor unions. They're kind of used to the sort of typical playbook of what a labor union can bring to the table. And then they're also used to them having the legal advantage in a lot of those situations in terms of getting injunctions or suing people or things like that. The other thing that Jobs with Justice brings to the table, too, is it's harder for them to sort of put those legal clamps down outside of the context of the sort of rigged labor laws that exist. So. Yeah, well, I think, it's always the case, I think, that, to a certain extent, people show up when they need something, right? I mean, that's the case with pretty much anything. And it's also, people show up when you organize them. I mean, that's the other piece of it, too. I think that, again, most of my experience was, kind of leading up the Walmart campaign. And so, you see groups that we connected with there and, like some of the returning citizens groups that I don't think would have necessarily thought of Jobs with Justice as like a place to go until that connection was made and until it started talking about like, well, we work with labor unions, we work with people who really want to push to make sure that everybody in the community has access to any good jobs that are brought to the community. And that all of a sudden that connection is made and those groups are at the table. And I think, it takes that kind of work, it takes being out in the community to do that. I think that there's sort of the institutional support that's, ebbs and flows a little bit from different labor unions depending on what they want to see happen, depending on what campaigns they're working on, depending on, how much support they think they can give for their own financial needs and memberships. And I guess I understand some of that more now, like in the role that I have now at UFCW. But like, again, if you want to have support when you need it, you need to give others support, even if you want to look at it from the sort of self-interested way, right? I mean, like we talk about solidarity a lot in the labor movement and we try and live those values, but the other side of that too is, you need to be there for other people if you want them to be there for you. And I think Jobs with Justice does a good job of sort of living that solidarity value, not in a kind of transactional way of you be here for me, so I'll be there for you, but in a more kind of like we share these same values. And that helps bring people to the table too. I think that other organizations outside of labor unions or even, more traditional allies within the community, can really see the value that Jobs with Justice brings to the work that they're trying to do, because it is not just a transactional relationship. It's more about understanding how we can all work together and how, unless we're all succeeding, then none of us are going to. Yeah, I mean, I think specifically here in DC, again, I think the city, I've been here for 20 years now. I think if you told me that this is what the city was going to look like 20 years from when I got here, I probably wouldn't have believed it necessarily. But also, like, I think a lot of people have done a lot of work to try and make the kind of development that's been happening in the city as inclusive as possible, as beneficial as possible to people who have lived here for a long time. But obviously that hasn't worked in every case. And I think that's going to be that's always been the struggle I see in DC, at least over the last 20 years. And I think it's going to be the struggle going forward too, is, what kind of city do we want to build as more and more people from outside are moving in, as rent goes up, as condo buildings go up. Like, how do we make sure that this is still a city that people who work for a living, are members of labor unions, do the kind of essential services that, whether it be grocery store workers, public sector workers in fire and EMS, school teachers, people who work in the hospitals here, can they afford to live here? Because that's what really maintains the city over the long term. And, I think that that's going to continue to be a struggle. But again, without an organization like DC Jobs with Justice kind of helping to lead up the push on that. Everyone kind of operates within their own little groups. They operate on their own little issues, which can get some things done. But until you bring all of that together and really get people focused on what the larger issues are as much as possible, and bring those coalitions together where people are working together for a common goal, you're not going to have as much success. And obviously the last 20 years have not been perfect, and nor were the next 5 to 10. But I think the big struggle in the city is going to continue to be the same, which is like who are we building the city for? Who are we building the things that are coming into the city for? Who is the development for? Who are the jobs for? And what kind of jobs are they? And what kind of city are we building for the future when we're more focused on condo buildings or filling in retail tenants and not as concerned about what kind of jobs those are going to bring and how sustainable it is. Yeah, I mean, I guess the last thing I'll share is I don't want to forget to mention the other thing that's going to happen in DC, and is happening now is and I think DC Jobs with Justice is rightfully involved in, is the continued push for statehood. I mean, I'm a little bit skeptical about how quickly that's going to happen, but I also think it's necessary, and it's something that is necessary, nationally for the health of our democracy, but also has been a long-term struggle for DC that hopefully can finally get resolved. And then the other thing I'll just say is that if we want a DC in the future that is inclusive, that allows people to have jobs that they can work and afford to live here, that doesn't just become a cookie cutter condo city that is not sustainable and eventually cycles down to just a whole bunch of empty luxury condo buildings, then we need an organization like DC Jobs with Justice. And whether it's support from us as labor unions institutionally or groups that people are involved in, or whether or not it's individual support, which I also happily provide to DC Jobs with Justice as a sustainer, it's very important that people continue to fund and support this organization, because if it's not here, the sort of forces that are pushing the city in the wrong direction are going to be the ones that dominate, and there's not going to be that counterbalance that's so important to making sure this happens. Yeah, so yeah, I'm very proud to be a sustainer of DC Jobs with Justice, as I have been for a long time, and I think that if people want to continue to have a counterbalance to the forces that are really trying to make this city a place where it's harder for people who work for a living to live, if we want it to be a place that's inclusive, if we want it to be a place where people can work, be members of labor unions, be members of their communities for the long term, then we need an organization like DC Jobs with Justice to really counter those forces, counter those corporate interests, counter those developer interests, and make sure that this is a city that's sustainable for all of us for the long term.